The transmission came through at 0347, ship time, when the corridor lights were still dimmed to half and most of the crew was asleep. I was not asleep. I was never asleep when we were this deep in conclave space. This far from anything human-made, this far from home. I sat in the small observation alcove at the rear of Deck 3, watching stars that had no names in any human language, holding a cold cup of coffee I had forgotten to drink. My name is Commander Yara Vasquez. I had been in the diplomatic corps for 11 years. I had shaken hands, or their equivalent, with 9 different species. I thought I understood the galaxy. I did not understand the galaxy. The message was flagged Priority 1 by our communications officer, Petty Officer Delgado, who knocked on the alcove door looking pale and slightly confused. He handed me a data tablet without saying a word. I looked at the screen. Then I looked at him. Then I looked at the screen again. It was a galactic broadcast. Ancient. The timestamp dated it to over 4,000 years ago, cycling on a deep frequency loop that our sensors had only just resolved cleanly enough to translate. The message was short. It had been carved, our linguistic system noted, into the foundation stone of every elder species' homeworld in their oldest written script. Someone had wanted to make sure it lasted. It read, "Do not provoke the pale architects. They are small and brief, and they do not stop." I read it 3 times. Then I set the tablet down, picked up my cold coffee, took a sip, and thought, "That is interesting." That reaction, I would later understand, was exactly what made the warning necessary. Humanity had been part of the galactic conclave for 190 years. In galactic terms, this made us roughly equivalent to a child who had just learned to walk and was very pleased about it. The elder species were polite about this, mostly. They welcomed us to the table. They explained the rules. They gave us trade access, communication rights, and a small but respectable voting bloc in the lower chambers. They also, quietly and consistently, did not take us seriously. This was not cruelty. It was simply mathematics. The Vethkai, the oldest active species in the conclave, biocrystalline beings who communicated through resonant light patterns and had been traveling between stars for 8,000 years, had seen dozens of young species join the conclave. Most grew slowly, many plateaued, some fragmented under the pressure of rapid expansion and simply stopped being relevant. Humans were notable for 3 things, according to conclave observation reports that I was not supposed to have read but had read anyway. First, we adapted to hostile environments at a rate that made environmental biologists uncomfortable. Second, we formed emotional attachments to things that made no logical sense. Our ships, our tools, our cities, names we gave to animals that could not understand the names. Third, and most significantly, we had never lost a war. Not once. Not in recorded contact history. The conclave noted this statistic. They did not know what to do with it, so they filed it under cultural peculiarity and moved on. The Vethkai ambassador to the conclave, a being named Tesserin of the First Facet, was considered the foremost diplomatic mind of his generation. He had, in open session, said the following about humanity. They peak fast and burn out. Give them a century, and they will fragment into extinction on their own. Fascinating, but not durable. Nobody corrected him. I remembered reading that quote in my first year at the academy. I remembered thinking it was rude. I did not think it was wrong. We were young. We were loud. We were emotional in ways that made other species visibly uncomfortable. Maybe he had a point. He did not have a point. The Varaketh Dominion controlled 19 star systems in the mid-rim and had been expanding steadily for 2 centuries. They were large, 8-limbed, deeply hierarchical, and operated on a simple principle. If a planet or station was in disputed space and could not defend itself, it was available. They called it threshold absorption. In their framework, it was not aggression, it was order. Unclaimed things needed a claimant. Sub-threshold populations needed a structure to belong to. Ceres Station 2 had a population of 11,307 people. It was a mining colony. The people there extracted rare mineral compounds from the asteroid belt and sent them back through the shipping lanes to Earth. They had schools, they had a hospital, they had 3 competing coffee shops, 2 of which hated each other, and a community garden that the residents were, by all accounts, unreasonably proud of. The Varaketh gave 48 hours notice to the conclave, not to the colony, and moved in. They did not kill anyone. They relocated the population to a nearby moon with minimal atmosphere and minimal supplies, and considered this merciful by their own standards. The station became a Varaketh processing facility. The community garden was demolished to install a fuel compression unit. I received the diplomatic brief at 0600 the following morning. I read it twice. Then I read the conclave's official response, which recommended that humanity pursue reparative dialogue through standard channels, with an estimated resolution timeline of 18 to 36 months. I sat with that for a long time. Then I drafted a one-line reply to the conclave. We will handle this ourselves. Earth's parliament convened the same afternoon. The debate lasted 6 hours, which some news commentators described as swift, and others described as remarkably calm, for a species that had just had 11,000 people relocated at gunpoint. The result was not a surprise. Emergency protocols were activated. Voluntary enlistment opened at midnight. 2 million people signed up in 72 hours. I was reassigned from Diplomatic Corps to liaison officer aboard the UNSPSA dreadnought, Unyielding Meridian, a ship that had been commissioned 3 years prior and had never seen combat. Standing on her bridge for the first time, I felt the particular feeling that humans get when something very large is about to happen and there is no way back. Not fear, exactly. More like the sensation of standing at the edge of a very high place and realizing that the fall has already begun. The shipyards were running continuous operations. Platforms that normally built commercial freighters were converting within 72 hours. Fabrication facilities on Luna went to 24-hour cycles. When the Unyielding Meridian joined the forming fleet in week 1, she was accompanied by 23 other dreadnoughts, 140 cruisers, and over 800 smaller vessels. And that number was growing. A Vethkai observer filed an official inquiry with the conclave, asking whether humanity was declaring war over a mining colony. The Secretary General of Earth replied on record, in open session, in a tone that was perfectly polite and somehow the most unsettling thing I had heard in 11 years of diplomacy. We are not declaring war. We are retrieving our people, dismantling the Varaketh military infrastructure in the belt, and ensuring this does not happen again. We expect to be finished in approximately 4 months. The conclave chamber was quiet for several seconds after that. I watched the recording from the bridge of the Unyielding Meridian, and noticed that Tesserin of the first Facet, in the back of the frame, had gone very still. He was staring at something on his personal display. I could not see what it was.
Now, the Varaketh were not a small opponent. I want to be clear about this.
They had a standing fleet of 400 vessels with centuries of tactical experience. They had absorbed 3 species without serious military resistance. They were disciplined and organized, and they fought according to a doctrine that had never failed them before. The doctrine was built on a concept they called threshold response. The idea that every rational species has a point at which the cost of continuing to fight outweighs the cost of stopping. You applied pressure. You calculated the threshold. You waited for the enemy to recognize that the math no longer worked in their favor. Then you negotiated from strength. The problem was that this doctrine required the enemy to be doing math. Human Marines do not do math in the middle of a corridor. They move forward. A Varaketh commander filed a report in week 2 stating that human soldiers had continued advancing through a contested passage after absorbing casualty rates that, by Varaketh doctrine, should have triggered mandatory tactical withdrawal. The report asked for guidance. His superiors told him this was impossible. He sent back the sensor logs. His superiors had no further guidance to offer. I received the ground engagement summaries and read them in my cabin at night. One of them described a search operation on the moon, where the colonists had been deposited, the moon that the residents themselves had named Patience, which is a very human thing to do when someone drops you on a rock with no atmosphere and minimal water. Human search teams had located and extracted 10,944 colonists within the first week. They kept looking. They found 12 more in a damaged maintenance facility on the far side of the moon that had been listed as non-viable by 3 separate scan teams. The facility's life support system was running on emergency backup power with 11 days remaining. The 12 people inside had rationed their food carefully and left notes for each other on the wall about whose turn it was to check the carbon scrubber. Nobody told the search teams to keep looking. The search teams just did not stop until they had all 11,307. The conclave convened an emergency session in week 3, not to intervene but to watch. This was, apparently, unprecedented. Wars had happened before within conclave space. They were generally managed through diplomatic pressure and economic sanction. Nobody convened an emergency session just to observe. Tesserin of the First Facet submitted a formal request to access the precursor archive. His research team worked through the session. I only learned this later, from a message he sent me, the first direct communication I had ever received from him. What they found was this: 4,200 years ago, there had been another species. The precursor warning referred to them as the Pale Architects. The records were fragmented, but the fragments told a consistent story. The Pale Architects had been short-lived, even by the standards of biological species. They had been emotionally volatile. They had formed intense attachments to their worlds, their communities, their specific people. They had been physically unremarkable, soft-bodied, limited sensory range, dependent on technology to survive most environments they inhabited. They had also been technologically innovative, at a rate that defied every predictive model the Vethkai ancestors had applied to them. The Vethkai ancestors had provoked them over a border dispute. A small thing, by galactic standards. A few contested systems. The Vethkai ancestors expected the threshold response. They expected math. The Pale Architects did not do math. They went home, and then they came back larger than before, and then they came back larger again, and by the time the Vethkai ancestors understood what was happening, the math no longer mattered. The war lasted 3 centuries. The Vethkai ancestors did not survive it. The species that did survive, scattered, rebuilt, eventually becoming the modern Vethkai, wrote the warning into stone on every world they touched, not as a record of victory, as a confession, as an instruction to every species that came after them. Do not start this. You will not be able to finish it. Tesserin of the First Facet sent me a message. It was 2 sentences. It read, "I understand now. I am sorry." I did not know what he understood yet. I would find out later. The Varaketh military infrastructure in the belt was gone in 6 weeks. The Secretary General had estimated 4 months. She had been conservative, because humans always build in time for things to go wrong, and this time, largely, things had not gone wrong. The Varaketh Supreme Commander, a being named Kethrak 7, requested a ceasefire negotiation through official conclave channels. I was assigned as one of the human delegates. The negotiation took place on a neutral station in the outer belt. Kethrak 7 was large, as Varaketh went, nearly 3 meters across the body, with eyes that processed light in 4 spectrums simultaneously. He had, I was told, never lost a military engagement before this one. He looked at me across the table with an expression that I could not read, but that reminded me, for some reason, of someone trying very hard to understand a language they had only just discovered existed. He asked me, "Why these terms? You could have taken our systems. You had the strength. Why did you not use it?" I thought about how to answer him. Then I answered honestly. "Because we did not want your systems. We wanted our people back, and your word that this would not happen again. We have our people. Now we want the word." He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "What if we had not been able to return them? What if they had been lost?" I looked at him. The room was very still. I said, "Then we would have stayed until there was no one left to ask us to leave." I did not say it as a threat. I said it the way you state a fact about weather, or distance, or the behavior of water. It is simply true that water flows downhill. It was simply true that we would not have stopped. Kethrak 7 signed the terms. 2 years later, I was sitting on a beach on the Pacific coast with my daughter, who was 9, and was currently attempting to negotiate a friendship with a shore crab. She had been at this for 20 minutes. The crab had not yet agreed to the terms, but had not left either, which she considered encouraging. I had finally replied to Tesserin's message. I had asked him what he understood. His response arrived in 17 pages of Vethkai script. The translation took 3 days. The short version was this. The pale architects were not unusual. They were early. You are what some species become when they are small and frightened and completely unable to accept the loss of the things they love. The warning was never about war. It was about what causes it. The Vethkai had sent a new broadcast to every species in the conclave. It was appended to the precursor original, which still read, in ancient stone-carved script, "Do not provoke the pale architects." The edition, transmitted by the oldest species in the galaxy to every civilization currently listening, read, "If you have provoked a species that fights not for expansion, but to go home, withdraw. You cannot outlast them. They will not stop. They still have something we have long forgotten. They have someone waiting." My daughter finally succeeded. The crab sat in her palm. She gasped with delight and looked up at me, radiant. "Mom, his name is Carlos." I laughed. Of course it was. I looked out at the water and thought about 11,000 people on a rock with no atmosphere, leaving notes about whose turn it was to check the carbon scrubber, waiting without any particular evidence that anyone was coming. They had been right to wait. We always come home.